When it comes to interpreting Russian culture, we are still stuck, and the more to the west you go, the more you are stuck, I believe, in that Cold War paradigm. We are used to what we were told about Russia during the Cold War, as the Soviet Union was kind of comfort zone dictatorship. There is no dissenting voice in Russian culture to present Russia as anything but empire. There's no internal system, there's no internal logic except of that of domination and subjugation of all those dissenting.
Welcome to the Wild East. We're joined today by Ostap Ukrainets, who is a novelist and a soldier in Ukraine's cultural forces. It's a pleasure to have him here. Ostap, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
To start things off, there's a lot of different directions we can go with this conversation, but I just want to start off with, how are you holding up? How are you doing? What's on your mind these days?
Holding up, depending on what you mean by that.
Sure.
Because I can, as all of us, feel more and more stress building up, but work-wise, it's all going on. I still have things I'm ordered to do. I have to do. I still do them, and this process, this never-ending, tasks appearing and me doing them, is what kind of holds me up today. Because once I stop doing something that needs to be done, it's frustration building up and some worse thoughts. So, well, working is what keeps rolling today.
How does your job in the army compare to what you were up to before you got mobilized?
It is a bit of a similar one and a totally different one. Similar one is I still work with information in the humanitarian sphere. So it has to do with culture, literature, history, language to a lesser degree. I used to be a translator. I translated books from English and Polish into Ukrainian. Now I mostly do that in the opposite direction, translating some Ukrainian stuff into English mostly. And on that level, it's all the same. I even find some half an hour once every other day to write some stuff for myself. Everything else, kind of information I work with, kind of tasks I am having, totally different, as the specifics of what I'm doing is different, and I'm not, I used to make educational videos and post them on YouTube. On my channel, Underground Humanities, you would translate it to English like that. I'm still kind of doing that, like once every half a year, but mostly all the information I used to be working with is channeled into what is needed, not what I want to be done.
So for a lot of the folks who are watching this, especially in the West, who are not familiar with the Ukraine Army's cultural forces, can you give us a quick breakdown of what is the cultural forces, and to the extent you're able to talk about it, what exactly is your job as a soldier in that unit?
It's not a unit, it's more like a union of people in the armed forces who had to do with culture and with information in general, because we have people with media experience, with marketing experience, actually, because to sell ideas, you must, well, sell those ideas, so you need people with marketing experience. The idea was to, first of all, support those on the front lines. That's what the union began with. Then it was preserving culture that is being created now on the front lines, as many people had some experience with the culture, as we can call it. People used to paint, used to write poetry, to write prose. They are still writing that, and someone must be looking after it while they have no time and they have no capabilities to work with that properly. So we had that project Frontline Studio of the bus, which was basically a musical studio, driving around the front lines and recording songs that were being written there at the time. Now we are making video clips for those songs, for new songs that are being released. We are helping with that release. releases. And third part of what we're doing is communicating Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian, well, worldview in general. That's what every nation does, even in the peace times, projecting their worldview and their idea of their place in that world. And we are kind of helping with that, considering state communication, politics, and cultural diplomacy.
How does the cultural forces project Ukrainian identity and Ukraine's message outside of Ukraine?
It's still work in progress, as we are looking for what works and what doesn't. We, as a nation, don't have much systemic experience of working in that field. We had lots of solo appearances, lots of projects that became popular, like Dacha Bracha, let's say, who are immensely popular outside of Ukraine, but they are one band touring with their own ideas to express. We totally support the ideas they express, but we lacked more systematic work when it comes to cultural diplomacy. So what we did last year was to organize several international tours aimed at expressing gratitude for the support we got from the USA. There were two tours into the USA and one tour into Turkey, which helped with Bayraktars and whatnot in the beginning of the full-scale war. And those tours helped us understand how we can work in the first place. What are the challenges of reaching to some audiences that are ready to hear about Ukraine and are ready to hear from Ukraine, but are still sometimes coming from a place of some misconceptions they had previously. Sometimes it's appreciating Ukraine and what's going on here without being ready to support us any further. Like, let's say, when it comes to voting for military support and whatnot, it's a no-go for them. But when it comes to being supportive of Ukraine in general, it's okay. So the idea is to find a way to speak to people who are generally open to Ukraine, to what we have to offer, but who are skeptical of what actually is going on. Culture is a great conversation starter. It is not a substitute for conversation. You cannot just take some cultural phenomena from your country, like some bandura players, some singers, whoever, and bring them and hope that it would work. Culture is bringing emotions to lead the conversation. It helps us build a framework we are talking in. When you show parts of your culture, you are implying that what you are showing is important to you. That is a place of that's a place your emotion are standing at. You are resonating with that, and through some music, through words, through some artistic form, you're trying to express what you deem valuable in these times, and you are asking others to join you in that dialogue. In this way, we are looking at what works where, what parts of Ukraine are people ready to hear in different nations. So the United States were the beginning, and now we are trying to make our way farther, as we have like many allies we are to even begin work with. We have really good relationships, but the lack of resources in all the previous years, it catches up with us, and still lots and lots of work to be done, even to reach some neutral level of we are doing everything we should be doing now.
Right. What's tracking well in the US? Can you say a bit about like what sort of messaging or what sort of cultural diplomacy do you find effective when you're trying to reach out to Americans?
I was on the Ukrainian side of the tour. I was helping prepare that tour, and I did some management in the early stages. Then I switched to different projects that required my attention. But from what I can see, um, we are supposed to be catering to different requests, as you cannot just prepare a concert or a concert program if you are having some ensemble of artists who are not in the same band and everyone has its own number or part of the program, and expect that this combination, whatever it was, will work properly. Because sometimes you're trying to reach different audiences, and people who are to visit your concert in some club or pub or whatever is not the same audience that will attend an event in the university. And the university is more about panel discussions and public lectures and seminars, and you have to look for all the possible ways to engage, and then you can engage with all the different people with basically the same message
Yeah.
in the end of the day, but you have to explore all the instruments you can
Mm.
to reach to as broad an audience as it is possible. And that same goes even for Ukrainians living abroad, as it can be kind of tough to communicate with all the diaspora of even one city, because like there are two or three groups who do not really communicate because they migrated in different decades, and those are already kind of different communities. And same and even more goes with the American audience, as sometimes working directly, let's say in state legislatures or in the Congress, worked better than any huge concert we could have organized, as people we could reach in the city council, state capital, the capital, are hugely different people from those who would attend any concert we can. So that's actually the challenge. By having a really limited number of people who can represent you, make sure that those people will be able to represent you on every level you can. And for that test ride into the United States, I believe the team was spectacularly good. I'm not sure if I will be able to share some video materials of the tour, as we are making a documentary. We are finishing making a documentary.
Okay.
It will be released sometime soon about that tour of gratitude. But that is actually something. By going to not the most sympathetic regions, Rust Belt and Bible Belt,
Yeah.
we actually succeeded at bringing together lots of people supporting us, and now realizing those are the people we can talk to, we can work with in the United States, no matter what happens in globally, internationally in the politics.
Yeah. I mean, you're from Ivano-Frankivsk in Western Ukraine, which is a place that I associate a lot with um, older traditions, a lot of kind of the older Christian values, which I see as having a lot of overlap with some of the more conservative messaging in the US. Is that an image of Ukraine that Ukraine, the cultural forces, the foreign ministry, other elements of Ukrainian soft power can try to push forward more to bridge that gap that we see between the Republican Party, kind of more conservative America, and Ukraine right now?
Obvious and honest answer is my homeland is not representative of the entire Ukraine, same as, let's say, Texas is not representative of the entire United States. But the image of the part of Ukraine I am at, but if we are speaking about values, and that's basically it, would be kind of understandable and kind of well familiar to many American conservatives, and actually many people in my part of Ukraine are sympathetic to the Republican agenda,
Mm.
especially because they feel the values are similar. I wouldn't say they are as similar in practice as they seem, because when you're talking about Ukrainian traditionality, it differs wildly from what you would expect in the United States. It's more about not just family values, but family rituals and social rituals, which I believe would seem alien to the Americans, as it's just not something you culturally experience in your life.
What do you mean? Can you give us
I mean that many traditions we engage in, like in Christmas time and especially Christmas and Easter time,
Sure.
are just a really orthodox traditions, which would look quite different. They are more about family ties, and by family ties, I mean not a nuclear family. I mean like a larger, greater family, including all the people who are related in some way, because it's not a social norm, but it's a custom to gather as a greater family for the holidays. Many traditions like Christmas carols, well, practice you would associate with the Halloween, most likely, of children going around and asking for treats. So that's Christmas for us. While presents are not Christmas, they are earlier in December on St. Nicholas Day.
Yeah.
And well, that's basically it. I've met two people, one who were from roughly my part of Ukraine, and from a conservative American family in Montana, I believe. And that there was a constant cultural friction, as the values are kind of similar, but all the external expressions of said values look kind of different. There's that uncanny valley when something is declared and is in fact kind of close to one another about family values and protecting the family as a social concept and so on, and marriage between man and woman, that all will be supported and repeated in Western Ukraine. The expressions of that values when it comes to traditions, to real social practices, would be immensely different.
Yeah, yeah. Let's, if we can switch that a little bit to what you're up against in this messaging war. And I guess I'm reappropriating the term culture war for a moment. So put culture war as a subsect of the information war, right? And what you're describing in terms of being able to find these shared common values, adjust your messaging through music, through other kinds of cultural export to folks in the U.S. is very different from what the Russians are doing. And when I think about how do the Russians get their information out there, it's more of a flood the zone with an army of Twitter bots, right, to influence things. What are you up against in this information war? What do you see the Russians as doing that is really making a mark and being able to basically take people who you'd think would otherwise be more sympathetic to kind of these Ukrainian Christian traditional values we're talking about, and then displace a lot of sympathy instead onto a country that's got, one of the highest divorce and abortion rates in the world, that's, flooded with alcoholism. And I'm talking about the Russians here, right? What are they doing, and why is it so effective in being able to shift the tide of opinion in Western countries?
I believe it's kind of a dangerous take to that Russian propaganda is. It boils down to an army of Twitter bots.
Okay, go on, please.
Because well, the latest scandal I can think of, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure most of American audience would not even hear of that, because well, World Press Award for photography goes to two pictures simultaneously. Ukrainian girl after the Ukrainian shelling, lying on the bed. Well, from the look of it, shell shocked. And the second one is really Rembrandt-esque, given its play of light and darkness, picture of Ukrainian the Russian soldier in the field hospital before the amputation, like in preparing for that operation. And those two pictures receive the award simultaneously, and then the World Association backs down, saying it was wrong of us to make those two points of view equal,
both sides.
because well, that second picture was made by a Russian state photographer working for TASS, who is well, basically a propaganda officer and is part of the problem in this war. He is the part of the war machine we are up against, but they refuse to do anything after that, and to do anything that requires, doing something. So the picture still receives an award, and we get that, well, next year we will review and perhaps rewrite our rules, whatever. We know we read your comments, now piss off. That's how it reads. And that's actually what we are up against. Because there's, when it comes to Russia, there are several um, directions you can take the talks of Russian propaganda. First of all, you have the internal propaganda. Those they cook for themselves. Most of Russian cinema falls into this category. They do not expect anyone outside of Russian in influenced territory like Russia, Belarus to a lesser degree. I'm not even sure if they are rolling it now, but Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, perhaps. I'm not sure if they are still showing Russian cinema. Maybe not. Then there is some avant-garde and art house stuff they would be shooting to present on international festivals and to get some awards, as they have brilliant connections when it comes to international awards, etc., as we can see with World Photo Award.
Yeah.
That's basically what happened. Then their internal propaganda will consist of books, especially fantasy and sci-fi, especially specifically Russian at this point, I believe, subgenre of a person traveling to the past. It's nothing new in Western or in Japanese sci-fi as well, but where the Russia is special is they turned that subgenre in a separate propaganda machine. And so when we are talking, well, in the West, on some book festivals, we're talking about books of obscure for all the Russian authors who are printed, I don't know, in some 1,000, 3,000 books per run, which is nothing. And then we have those books printed in hundreds of thousands that all the Western academia analyzing Russian literature failed to recognize as existing. Because, well, and that's another direction we can be, we are having problems now, actually, because Russian studies, and by extension Slavic studies, which are often just Russian studies with more fancy name to look more inclusive, they focus on what Russia has created in the past as a tool of projecting a soft power, which is mostly classics from the 19th and sometimes from 20th century, to adore, to overanalyze. And well, you visit any Russian studies faculty or department website, you find tons of works on Dostoevsky, on Tolstoy, on Pushkin, while at the same time those academia institutions fail to recognize that this is not what Russian culture looks nowadays. They ignore what internal propaganda machine is printing. They ignore the actual cultural context common Russians are living within. They do not read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy the same way most Westerners who said they read never actually read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but for some reason you still, in every other American movie, especially more independent ones, you oftentimes see the books, as just a cultural token to show that we remember the great Russian culture, as is every reference to a ballet somehow a reference to Russian ballet because no other country does ballet for some reason. And I realized that coming from a country which is, I believe, solitary in this world in its love for baseball, let's say, we see baseball, we assume the United States.
Hey, the Cubans in Japan too.
Yeah, but when I see someone playing baseball in a cinema or whenever, I never think. I know that Japan plays baseball as well, but I never assume, well, that's Japan, that's United States. But for some reason, this stuff works with ballet in Russia.
Yeah,
I don't know why,
definitely.
but the connection exists, so every mention of it is already connected. And when I was watching, let's say, Fallout series, a series that has historically nothing to do with Russia, to a degree that what even happened to the Soviet Union was at some point a question of some debate among the fans, because it's about the United States and China, all those prehistory. And somehow in the series, there is a token book of Tolstoy, War and Peace, because of course there is, because it just a custom, it's just a habit. We're looking at what Russia had to offer in the 19th century to explain what it is today, which is wrong on so many levels.
Sure. There was an article that you wrote in Medium back in 2022 that I believe was your most translated piece in English. You were talking about Dostoevsky and you were talking about the death of Russian culture. What does this mean, the death of Russian culture? What does it look like now? And can you give us a bit of history? Where did this come from? When did this happen?
Okay, so first of all, I have to clear things out about death, because this formula is actually used to poison the well in this discussion really often. Because, if you were saying death of whatever, well, you're trying to cancel that. And if you're talking about death of Russian culture, well, it's culture wars. You're trying to cancel the entire Russian culture, which is not what is going on, in fact. Because since Roland Barthes, in his concept of death of the author, which does not actually mean that author has no right for his works. He just loses the monopoly on interpreting those works. And the person looking at culture is as vocal an interpreter as the author himself. So when we're talking about death of the culture, what I personally mean, and what it, strictly speaking, means as a linguistic formula, is that our previous view on what Russian culture means and what it represents is incomplete. First of all, it's kind of old and even antique at this point. Second of all, and so you cannot actually move on and read and comprehend and interpret Russian culture for what it is without making some serious adjustments to how you read it, to how you interpret what you are actually working with. And I understand that for more casual readers, that is kind of nothing, because, well, if you're a casual reader, you just read a book. That's it. I'm a casual reader of spy novels myself. I will understanding the implied politics. I will not give a damn about the implied politics as long as I'm enjoying the text. There's nothing wrong with that in general, but we are still prisoners of some paradigm of interpretation, because you can be a person who just read Lolita, Nabokov's Lolita, for what it is and do not care about interpretation at all. But the way it is interpreted when it is taught, is it really a love story, or is it an unreliable narrator and a pedophile trying to convince us that his version of events is true? Well, that matters. That stuff matters. And so when it comes to something like classics, something that is present in literary canon, something that is taught in schools and universities, you end up with the need to have some official, well, not official like state imposed, but official interpretation, like consensual interpretation. And if that interpretation ignores the actual cultural role of some text, well, perhaps that interpretation is incomplete. Perhaps the fact that we ignore the actual development of Russian culture in the last 30 years should call us for taking a pause and reviewing, not canceling, not throwing out, but reviewing some clusters of literature in light of those recent developments. Because right now, when it comes to interpreting Russian culture, we are still stuck, and the more to the west you go, the more you are stuck, I believe, in that Cold War paradigm, which is, I believe, it really understandable for the Americans. That kind of hate-respect relationships with Russia as the Soviet Union. Well, Russia played perfectly impersonating the entire Soviet Union, making it look like that everything that happened via Soviet Union, including science, technical achievements, warfare. It was all on Russia, and like the Second World War was not at all won by Western led-lease and with the hands of Ukrainians and Belarusians who faced the biggest impact of Wehrmacht forces, while Russia was barely scratched in the Western part. So there's that point, that part. And in general, we are used to what we were told about Russia during the Cold War, as the Soviet Union was kind of comfort zone dictatorship. You know, it's a dictatorship. It's an evil place, but it's a meme evil place. It's a place we are be doing jokes like in Soviet Russia about. It's a place where we will profanize the extermination of millions of people and tens and dozens of peoples who were assimilated during the 20th century. Well, just because it's kind of exotic, you know. It's kind of something mysterious about that place. And when it's mysterious, when we are allowed that distance, we are kind of okay with tolerating millions dying because it works within the narrative we are used to. And that's basically the problem. Russia has created an idea that we cannot do, not without it on the world map. We're not talking about dismantling Russia as a state. We cannot do without their interpretation of their culture that we agreed upon after the Second World War. And many people are still buying that stuff and buying into it. And so the problem is that voice of Russia after the Second World War was filled with suppressed voices of other nations. And Ukraine was totally one of those nations, same as Belarusia, Georgia, and Armenia. And well, like any state is that is having problem with Russia today, was a part of that suppressed collective voice. And now that the world has changed and the Soviet Union, which stood on immense resources of Azerbaijan and Ukraine and other countries providing it with food and oil and whatnot, the myth perseveres. We are still believing that myths Russians were telling the world about themselves and trying to uproot that myth and not even throw it away, but just review what we already have and accommodate that, perhaps adjust it somehow to the need of the day and to the reality we are facing. Is sometimes unthinkable to some people, and I understand people who build their careers interpreting classic Russian culture, and that interpretations now need a review. What I don't know is how the hell the conservatives, people who are famously suspicious of academia to sometimes to conspiracy levels, are totally okay with an actual conspiracy, which is old and is not a conspiracy anymore. Now it's just a habit. But it all started as an attempt of Stalin's Soviet Union, not Russia of today, to cement its role and its cultural influence in the world, in European academia, and it ended up in American academia as well. Not a problem on its own. It's easily treatable with just, well, learning something you know. But the bias is still there, and the bias is actually ignored on both sides for the most part. And sometimes it is recognized, and it pleases me to see that more and more people engage with this topic critically in the West as well. But strategically, Russia maintains its informational influence on Western academia, and lots and lots to be done in this field. And that is part of what Ukraine is trying to do with the strategic communications.
If we're taking this back, I mean, you talked about Roland Barthes a little bit earlier, right? And if we're taking this back to Stalin's Soviet era attempts to repress not just Ukrainian but all of the other nationalities, including his own, right? In the interest of this Russian leading identity. To what extent do you blame the sort of Western socialism and communism and how that infiltrated the West and Western academia in the 60s, in Barthes, in Foucault, and Derrida, in helping support some of this narrative? I mean, I know this was something that Macron talked about a few years back, somewhat blaming the Americans for exporting some of these ideas, which the U.S. actually got from French philosophers in the 60s, right? Sort of had this back and forth through academia.
I I blame. Well, blame is not really a useful word here
Sure.
because my blame will change nothing. But I believe that hypocrisy of knowing for a fact of what was going on in the Soviet Union and rooting for it, it was not intellectually sincere at no point in time. It reminds me uh, people I know today who kind of know of the Uyghur genocide in China, but they're still okay with China as a whole.
Still buying that H&M fast fashion,
I
right? Yeah.
it's not even about buying fast fashion because I myself try to boycott Chinese goods wherever I can. My laptop, my phone are not Chinese. I took care of that especially, but well, you can't avoid it, of course, but you can avoid it as much as you can at least.
Yeah.
And well, it's not some particular school of thought that bought into Russian propaganda wholesale, although there were circles that bought into it, of course. But it really depends on when in time are you looking at. Because in the 30s we had the Holodomor, of course, and the New York Times, well, they had the material of how there is no Holodomor in Ukraine, and because of that, almost 100 years later, Ukrainians still do not trust New York Times for shit. Because if they publish something on Ukraine,
Yeah.
they are most probably lying because of that story almost a century ago. That's reputation. But then it was different within the Soviet Union. So any external projection that people bought into is well, it's doomed to be wrong, because before the Second World War there was that two narratives. In fact, while we are establishing the Soviet power here, you can have your own elected officials, you can have your own just state officials and your commissars and whoever. All the people who run the state will be of your own. All the people who do not speak Ukrainian will learn to speak Ukrainian for some 5 to 7 years, and then they are shot. So I cannot but laugh at it at this point, which is tragedy, but there's no way you can react to it properly because
Classic Ukrainian wartime
the
hero.
irony of our national Bolshevism, national communism, is that all those people were sincerely left, who were shot, who were killed first in 32, 33, then in 37, and the narrative after that first years was that, well, the proletarians, they have no motherland, they have no nationality, they are just part of that um, world commune of the working class. And then the World War II happens. And during that war, the 1941 and later on, the narrative shifts completely. Now it's all about motherland, it's about protecting motherland, about all those national sentiments that would have you killed 2 years prior. Now it's all about that. And so here, I believe, lies the problem with experiencing Russian culture abroad, because if you look at it as it happens, it is so filled with contradictions. You cannot extract any higher narrative from there, because all the narratives that hold this culture together are rooted in 17th century and earlier. There is nothing to create a modern national identity. It's all about the past, that through which this current identity somehow came into being. And so that is an issue, because when you look not even on the entire Soviet Union runtime, Stalin's runtime, you can see different iterations of totally different policies depending on what was, um, well, I don't know if acceptable is the word here, of what was needed, let's say. There's no internal systems, there's no internal logic except of that of domination and subjugation of all those dissenting. And I believe that is the concept that is hardly translatable to Western state of mind, especially in Western academia. And people who understand how that works, like Anne Applebaum, who wrote time and time again about how the Russian Empire worked, still means little to people who are 100% sure that Russia was never an empire, and the Soviet Union was not some kind of weird postmodern empire, especially after the Second World War and after the Warsaw Pact, which literally gave Stalin half of Europe. And we are now dealing with aftermath of that aftermath of decades of politics that were during the Soviet Union directly aimed at forming that idea of a friendly totalitarian state. A totalitarian state you can tolerate, you can allow to exist as you understand this state. It is not closed on itself. It projects a lot of what it wants you to know about it. I would compare that to what South Korea did with K-pop, actually, because K-pop was a state policy. I'm not sure if you know this entire story. So they had this idea in the late 20th century that South Korea would be pioneer in genetics, in cloning, and the Dolly ship. Surely you heard of Dolly, and all that experiments, which eventually failed, and they failed spectacularly. And human cloning is banned, and the only remnants that we in Ukraine know about is some Brazilian TV show Clone about the issue, which was made sometime in the early 21st century.
Okay.
And then the South Korea changed its course, and it decided that culture is the way to enter the global arena. Culture is a way to sell the image of South Korea of today and of the future, and K-pop became that export material. Russia did not try to create some actual, like, today's expert material, but using all the old infrastructure, it is now proficient in exporting all that used to be, all that is politically neutral. Because, well, today everything is politically loaded, everything is with that flavor of war in Ukraine, in Georgia, for those who remember the 2008, and so on. Classical culture, despite of it being created right as Russia was conquering Caucasus, as it was subjugating people of Middle East, Middle East in our European understanding, in steppes of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on. This culture is still loaded, isn't it? It's still a kind of propaganda. The point, it's a propaganda of 19th century Russia. Okay, but the ambition of modern day Russia is no different. If they use it in the same way it was used in the 19th century. It was used as a showcase of Russia having a great culture. And if you're having a great culture, you are not, in that old imperialistic interpretation, a barbarian. You are a real state in those terms, meaning a land or a sea empire. And that is why Russia is trying so hard to build everything in a dialogue with the United States and the Chinese. That's their interpretation of how the world should work. And that classical culture, which could be read on its own, which could be read without all the flair of politics Russia is imposing nowadays, had we given it a thorough read, keeping in mind the way Russia uses it. It is not. It remains a propaganda. It remains a propaganda of Russia as an empire because, well, the narrative of that literature is one of Russia as an empire. There is no dissenting voice in Russian culture to present Russia as anything but empire. There's just none that I'm aware of. And state literature, and I call that sci-fi and fantasy state literature, as it is totally state funded, not for the most part, but for a large part. It is state supported. It is and its distribution is immense. It is just a continuation. It is there is a problem with Russian literature that I'm aware of as a translator. Because oftentimes facing some challenges in English text, and I like working with tough texts like Neil Stevenson, David Mitchell, like tough texts.
Yeah.
And so, facing some linguistic challenges, I often compare it to how it was done in Polish, in Czech, and in Russian. And what I face oftentimes is that it is not done in Russian translation. While facing with some challenges in a foreign text, Russians will just, well, eliminate the challenge. They will delete a paragraph with tough wording or whatever. And so this is problem number one, that, well, culture is hugely distorted. The Western culture ending up in Russia is often really distorted. But the second point is that voices of their translators are eerily similar. There are several authors they use as a reference point because those voices are instantly recognizable in Russian culture. And that's Dostoevsky's voice. And when it comes to psychology, Tolstoy's voice when it comes to descriptions, Gogol's and Saltykov-Shchedrin's voice, and Ilf and Petrov, as they were immensely popular in the Soviet Union, when it comes to humor. And to, there are more, but not that many. And you recognize how author's voice is being erased in favor of those voices favored and known by Russians, in favor not of Russian language and its abilities, but certain Russian voices and what they offered before. And I believe that is a symptom of that same problem. As Russia consumes, and, well, Ukraine was part of that problem. Not so long ago, in the Soviet times, I found horrifically massacred Western books like The Godfather, with almost a third of the book gone.
No kidding.
First version of The Godfather I read was literally just the retelling of the movie. Only those episodes left in the movie were left in the book, and that's it. It's a funny read. If you know the original, it's a funny read. But then we consumed a really butchered version of the Western culture. And Russia is offering a really butchered version of its own culture, but is doing that on purpose. And that's what we often fail to recognize, because it's not about kicking off the world stage everything that is Russian. It's first maybe not being so obvious about being sympathetic to Russians as they commit genocide, but just for a change. And then the second part is actually fucking read Russian books and engage with the Russian art as it exists today and not some 200 years ago, because that is a version of Russian Empire that modern day Russia is trying to follow. Well, we are not trying to follow that image. We are not, it's not a must for us to fall into this trap, but we oftentimes fall because it's easier to do so, as it requires no extra steps on our part. We just follow what we are shown.
One thing that comes to mind when you're talking about all this is the ways in which these Russian cultural depictions come at the expense of, I should say, Russian cultural narratives come at the expense of Ukrainians in terms of how they're depicted. And one article that you wrote really dove into the ways that Ukrainians are negatively depicted in modern day Russian war propaganda films, or the stereotypical token, like lazy or whatever other negative trait you have, Ukrainian soldier who has to undergo some sort of Russification, right? The other thing that came to mind when I was reading that was this maybe infamous speech that Zelensky's character gives, like the Hochul speech in the Servant of the People TV series. You talked a lot about dating this back to Stalin, going back to Holodomor times, but how much further does this Russian characterization of Ukrainian negative stereotypes go historically? Like, how far can we take this back?
So there's an easier answer and there's a more in-depth one. So the easier part is when depicting especially Ukrainians in Russian military, which is important because when I was a teenager, everyone, every boy I knew, almost everyone, every boy I knew, I didn't ask all of them, but still, we're watching this Russian TV series Кадетство in Russian. So cadethood as a cadets as students of military of high military school, and then there is детство, like childhood part. So it's a coming of age story of teenage boys like us who chose the military as their path, and it's really and really subtly. I from a technical standpoint, I adore how they did an anti-Western sentiment in that one. It is really subtle. It's difficult to pinpoint where exactly they're doing that, but they're doing that brilliantly, and it worked brilliantly, mind you, because well, boys of my age were fans of the show, and not only that, because after that you have like the trainees series, and then soldiers series, and all the military career depicted through the lens of that people, and one of them is a young cadet with a precisely Ukrainian last name. In Russian, it's Perepechko. They pronounce it the Russian way, but Perepechko in Ukrainian language would be not the most common, but easily recognizable and normal Ukrainian last name. And he is from somewhere which in Russia. He's not from Ukraine. He's from Russia, but from ethnically Ukrainian territories, which is known in Russia as well. That well, those people are more like Ukrainians than they are like Russians. Their language, the dialect they speak, is close to Ukrainian. That's in lower Don River. Kuban region. But then he is that Perepechko. Well, he is fat, like it is accented. It's used as a pejorative in. It's used as a way to denigrate him within the series to show that he has some weight that he needs to lose to become a true man. You know,
I'm picturing like the Private Pile in Full Metal Jacket, if you're familiar, almost.
more goofy.
More goofy.
More goofy, I would say. He is the goofy character, and he is a character in the last stages of his assimilation into Russian culture. His parents are talking more in that, well, in Russian imagining of what the dialect looks like. It's nothing like reality, but he is still ashamed of how his parents talk while he is with his cool Russian speaking friends. And that is the idea of the Ukrainian in the army. As the soldiers series shows us this same cadet just some, I don't know, 35 years later, when he is in his 50s and he is some I'm not sure how you call who is lower than lieutenant in U.S. military.
Sergeant is the senior enlisted guy, and then we have second lieutenant versus.
So yeah, we have this
Always
stage
lieutenants?
between sergeant and lieutenant,
Ah, okay.
which is really not a sergeant, not yet an officer. It was it's a character of anecdotes in the Russian army. To be plain, most of anecdotes about Russian army are about this guy, the flag bearer, if you literally translate what he is. And so this guy is Ukrainian. He is neither here nor there. He is somewhere in between this silly fat Ukrainian character with Ukrainian last name Shmatko as well, totally Ukrainian last name. And so this is the image that is reserved for Ukrainian character. On one hand, we are lucky here. We have an image reserved for us somewhere in the imperial mindset, as most peoples that the Russian army consists of, and as it was in the Second World War, as it is now, Russian army mostly consists of not Russian people ethnically, and same goes here, but they are not mentioned. They are not mentioned in Kадетство, they are not mentioned in soldiers. They do not exist. They exist solely to die on a real battlefield, not to be represented. So, as Ukraine is ideologically important for Russia, Ukraine is represented. And this representation, same as ideological importance of Ukraine for Russian state project, is kind of old and is kind of Ukrainian origin, actually. And then the second part, because uh, before all that even happened, there was like Ukrainian Kazakh state, and within that state, the hetmanate, there was a tradition that exists until today in Ukraine of Christmas plays. Like a story about baby Jesus being born, and common people from Ukraine, common people you meet on everyday basis in Ukraine of the time, are coming to visit him and to get filled with hope for the better future, and the world will be renewed. Typical Christmas story for you. And there is a typical Ukrainian warrior in this story. And the earliest story surviving is the end of 17th century, uh, right around when Kazakh statehood was destroyed by Russia, but still a little bit before that. And you get this image of a goofy Ukrainian character in his, you don't know, but 40s or 50s, as he is whining that his old strength is waning, and he is not as strong as he was, and he is not as brave as he was. And obviously, he is a metaphor of the political state of Ukraine at the time. He represents the state, not the actual Ukrainian person. He represents all the old glory that used to be, because he boasts that old glory, and there is little he can do now, and that is the source of his frustration. That was an image crafted for a precise time, which was 2.5 centuries ago, which is understandable for modern day Ukrainians, but it it says nothing to any external audience who doesn't know the context. What the Russians did, they actually took the image and ran with it. They just decided that that one author parody that people did about themselves, about their problems, in some certain decade of the time. That is now how we present all Ukrainians, all of the time, forever. They just took the image and ran with it, and they refabricated it into a stereotype about Ukrainians. It entered their state propaganda. Partly because this image was not one-time use. They did not take that from the Vertep. Hohol, who was from Ukraine, who was from Poltava region, which was historically immensely important for Russia as part of their mythos, as Battle of Poltava was the point at which they were able to occupy Ukraine. And so he, being from that most Ukrainian, as Russians would imagine that part of Ukraine, he was familiar with that tradition of verteps. He used that image of Cossack from Vertep to depict old Cossacks as he saw them as a kid. He lived in a world with all that old glory guys being boomers of his time, literally. So it's kind of like that kind of humor. The world moved on, but the person still clings to the world gone by and lives in its own microcosm. That's what the image was originally about, the person who was not able to move forward with the world. It's generational humor. It's a boomer anecdote right there in Hovel. But then Russian state decided, no, it's not. No, it's not. Now it's the way we speak about Ukraine, and nothing will ever change that. So when we are facing similar depictions today, it's 300 years for us. It's maybe new. It may be news for some people abroad. for most people abroad, frankly speaking. But for us, it's A, nothing new, and B, we know exactly what is the problem with that image. And well, it just pisses us off when people who lack the proper context, even if they studied Ukrainian culture, they still lack the proper social context often, especially if they studied Russian and not Ukrainian culture. And to hear that people saying, well, we have kind of a monopoly on interpreting this literature, this is the way it's supposed to be read. And the funny thing was, I was giving a lecture on Hohol and his double identity, the way he writes as Ukrainian, the way he writes as Russian. Because I believe there are two distinct periods in his writing. First, he was a Ukrainian author trying to become popular in the Russian capital. Then he realized that was not working out as good as he wanted, and he was really disappointed with Russia in general. So he became writing satires on Russia as he was already living there. His first satires are much milder, and because they, well, he laughs on his own. We always have a milder and more gentler laugh when talking about ourselves. And so there are those two voices, one more sympathetic as he writes about Ukrainians, even if they're goofy, and one with no remorse as he's writing about Russians. He does not give them any redemptive qualities. I was given a lecture about Ukrainian substrate in his writing, the way some images he uses trace their origins back to Byzantium period, back to Middle Ages, as they were reused several times, and he got them from people reusing them, like from Cossack era, because Cossacks were all in for reusing the old Byzantic imagery. That was kind of their thing. And so after that, to my wife, because she was present physically there, I was just on a Zoom call. I was in a booty camp at the time, but the lecture still was scheduled, so it went on. It was in Zurich, in Switzerland. And so my wife was approached by a woman who studies Russian literature and Gogol specifically in Switzerland. And her question was, where do I read more about this literature that predates Hohol, as I've never heard of it. I've never heard of one of the biggest literary influences on the author I'm studying, because, well, the unspoken part here, because I was schooled in a system that does not talk about that second part, because it's a system focused on Russian approach to literature. So that's how it works. To this day, generally speaking.
Well, I know I could probably keep you here forever, Ostap. I know you're a busy guy. So let me close out with one question about language. And this is something that I have tried and honestly totally failed at being able to explain to my friends back in the US. And part of it is because I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian. My Ukrainian is Duzhapana. So basically, we're living in this very bilingual country here in Ukraine. But you are obviously from a place that is really exclusively speaking the Ukrainian language in college. Not so much. You're shaking your head.
You would be surprised by my answer, but please go on.
Okay, so with given that so much of identity is tied to the language that we are speaking, can you talk a little bit about what are the kinds of challenges that Ukraine will be facing in the future? Let's say that there is some sort of peace deal and the war ends and we're able to sort of somewhat live in some sort of semblance of peace going forward. How is Ukraine going to be able to navigate this bilingualism going forward? Does it pain you when you hear Russian spoken today in Kyiv? And just talk a little bit about what this means to you.
First of all, Ukraine was frankly successful at navigating bilingualism ever since 2014, when we first addressed the issue. Before we did that, Ukrainian was just simply suppressed bit by bit, year by year, and kicked off the TV and the educational system and so on. Since 2014, after the revolution, when we first addressed the issue, we were doing great with bilingualism, I believe. We had our deal of scandals and call it cultural wars. I'm not sure. Well, that's the term people understand at least. So let's, yeah, call it culture wars about what Ukrainian is supposed to be like, what Ukrainian is right or wrong. Uh, First of all, well, I nowadays live in a region of Ukraine that is predominantly Ukrainian speaking, yeah, but with a lot of Russian speaking people as well. It's in the West. First of all, Western Ukraine is not all the Ukrainian speaking, same way as Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine is not predominantly Russian speaking. The distribution is kind of different, and the more it goes, the more different it gets, because many people from the south and from the east are being relocated, are relocating themselves to the western parts. So the map is shifting rapidly. We actually have no idea on how it is shifting, but Russian is not the only language here, because in the region I live in, which is close to Romania, many people speak Romanian. A bit to the west, region that is bordering Hungary, many people are speaking Hungarian, and local dialects, which is to be expected, are a weird mixture of those languages. And if Russian and Ukrainian are kind of similar, and you can imagine some borderline dialect between existing between them, like it will be milder in the central part, it will be more like Russian in the northeasternmost part. But same goes for Russian language. The more you go to the border of Ukraine, the more proper Russian in villages, in vernacular, will look like Ukrainian. That works everywhere. And we have different languages on our periphery as well, Romanian and Hungarian being the most prominent. So what is the challenge here? First, the challenge is, and we are almost done with that, to make sure that Ukrainian is not endangered. Because the problem before the revolution, and even nowadays it sometimes occurs, the problem is that while the Ukrainian language is official, you sometimes cannot buy stuff if you speak Ukrainian. You cannot get some commodities from the state just because the person is a jerk and wants you to speak Russian. That happened. That happened to me a lot. That does not happen now. That does not happen now because we have a general policy regarding Ukrainian. And now, about talks of Russian being banned, it is not, but it is restricted in the areas it had huge advantages because of Russia. Like Russian books are not banned; they are still being printed in Ukraine, but importing books from Russia is banned. You cannot do that. So what happened is, without Russian support and without Russian money, the number of Russian books being published in Ukraine plummeted. It, like, nowadays we print more books in English than we do in Russian. And that really shows how many people actually need this stuff, right? Because, well, the market is free. No publishing house is forced to publish books in Ukrainian. And we actually have more scandals about someone publishing some bullshit in Russian, which turns out to be Russian propaganda on their own resources. But no one says anything about that being published in general. If you want to buy Russian, you can, but do you really want to? Those who want, they have their market. And without Russian influence, without Russian market, and without Russians being really supportive when helping Ukraine to obtain rights to the Russian translations of some books so that Ukrainian never appear as well, you already have one. It turned out that the market for Russian literature is really small. And the problem we are about to face whenever the war ends, whenever it is safe to come back to Ukraine, is that people who migrated in 2022 will not recognize the countries they will return to. Because many of them, they preserved the linguistic and the social identities they had while escaping. And partly we didn't do enough as a state. Partly we couldn't have done enough as a state because it requires a lot of preparation work which was not done in advance all the decades before. We should have done that to maintain some infrastructure abroad, not to rely on Ukrainian NGOs and their spaces and their people, but keeping something of our own. We already did not do that when the war began. We honestly did not have enough resources to do that properly back then, and we struggle to do it now, but we are at least trying to do it now and to do it the right way, I hope. We did not have enough informational infrastructure to support people who moved abroad and to help them remain connected to Ukraine informational space, because when you all the connections you retain are ones to the social bubble you had before, and if majority of that social bubble ends up abroad just like you, which was often the case with people escaping Kharkiv or the regions that were the most threatened, there's nothing you can do to move on, to keep in touch with what is actually going on. The point I'm notice often around people I know, among people I know, is that they imagine Ukraine as far bleaker and desperate place than it is today, actually.
Okay.
Partly, and I cannot dissent here. I must agree with when they say that war influenced us. We got used to the things no one should be getting used to. Yeah, no one should be getting used to sleeping while strike drones flying overhead. But then, what would you do? Not sleep for 3 years? You must get used. You must get used, and this difference is unbreachable. It's experience-driven difference. But then, uh, when you were abroad, that's all you know about Ukraine. That's all you see. Sure. Every time you're facing something Ukrainian, it's some apartment block or hospital or kindergarten being bombed, and every time it's just shelling and bombing and killing, and that's Ukraine for you when you're living abroad and you have no connection to some actual social spaces existing here. Yeah. When you live here, yeah, it's bombing, but that's all the stuff in between that takes most of your days and you are living it. So yeah, this difference of experience, it will go farther than just linguistic aspect. But people living far from the Russian threat will have really different approach to what it means to use anything Russian after the war. Today, I hear Russian, it triggers me, of course, but it triggers me to a lesser degree than it was pre-war, mind you, because now I understand the stress factor. I may understand the reluctance. For many people, inability too, because they never studied Ukrainian. If you are over 50, I believe that the person might not speak Ukrainian at all. There was such a possibility back then, after all. You could go without Ukrainian in Ukraine. And I do not have illusions that in next 10 years, Ukraine will become Ukrainian speaking in general. I also do not have illusions that this status quo with part of Ukraine being considered, especially being considered abroad as Russian speaking, as we see today time and time again, especially with the new American administration, this talking point will become a thing of the past, because that's not true. That was not true back then. It's even less true now, as we are seeing a constant and coordinated attempt to adapt to the Ukrainian cultural reality, because that's actually one of the points about survival in this. You have to forge a collective identity that is not oriented on Russia. You could have done that before. Now it's far more difficult. Now it's borderline impossible. Okay. You have to look for something in Ukraine to engage you. And that's what people are doing, not because Russian culture is prohibited in any way, but because it's, self-prohibited often. You can, you can, and I know people are still listening to some old music of their youth, not in public, and for a reason. No one will, some people will judge you totally, but no one will do anything physical to you, learning that you, when at home, listen to some Russian rock.
Mm-hmm.
People will have much less condescending opinion on you listen that in public, simply because you are not like indulging in your nostalgia. You are imposing your nostalgia as a part of international context,
Mm.
as a part of cultural context, taking roots from the Soviet Union, as a part of what actually led us to this predicament in the first place.
Yeah.
So yeah, that works like that. And I understand why the concept is kind of difficult for people living abroad, especially as they uh, do not know the historical. Why would they? Why would anyone want to learn 300 years of history of Central European nation just to understand how language works in Ukraine nowadays? That's understandable. The problem is that that basic understanding it needs to be changed somehow, and the idea that part of Ukraine speaks Ukrainian and part of Ukraine speaks Russian is right only if you ignore all the context that you need to properly understand that sentence. So that's why it should be avoided. All the umbrella judgments about Ukrainian and Russian context should be avoided, actually, just because A, too much luggage from the Soviet era, and B, too little actual information to comprehend the implications of that basic judgmental sentences about this part of Ukraine being this and this part of Ukraine being that.
Mm. Well, Ostap, thank you very much for joining us today. If you liked this interview, please like and subscribe and share, and we'll see you next time on The Wild East.